The forest was thick with silence that morning. The explorer had been walking for hours, his boots pressing softly into the damp earth. He wasn't following a trail anymore. The faint path he had started on had disappeared long ago, swallowed by wild plants and creeping roots. Yet something in him kept going. He had heard the stories, whispers from old villagers who spoke about a strange metal shape hidden deep in the forest. Most people laughed it off, saying it was just a legend. But he wasn't one to ignore a mystery. He carried a small backpack filled with water, a camera, and a notebook. Each step took him deeper into a place that felt untouched by time. The air smelled of moss and rain, and sunlight barely reached through the thick branches above. Every few minutes he stopped to listen, expecting to hear birds or the rustle of an animal. But the woods stayed oddly quiet. The deeper he went, the more it felt like the forest was holding its breath. He paused near an old fallen tree, catching his breath and wiping sweat from his neck. He checked his compass and map again, though neither helped much. According to the coordinates he had marked, the area ahead should be flat land. Nothing special. Still, his gut told him to keep moving. He had been exploring lost places for years. Old tunnels, forgotten railways, abandoned mines. But something about this search felt different. There was a strange pull to it, like he was walking towards something that had been waiting to be found. After another hour, the ground began to rise slightly. The trees grew thicker, their roots twisting like ropes across the soil. He stepped carefully, pushing through vines that clung to his jacket. Then he noticed something, an unusual sound beneath his boots. A hollow echo, as if the ground wasn't solid. He knelt down and brushed aside a layer of leaves. Beneath the dirt, his fingers touched metal. He frowned and scraped more of the soil away. The surface was rough and cold, streaked with rust. At first, he thought it might be an old container or farming equipment, but as he cleared more of it, he realized it was something much larger. He stood up, heart pounding, and scanned the area. The forest around him looked normal, but something massive was hidden under years of growth. He began walking in a circle, tracing the shape beneath the ground. The metal stretched far in both directions, curving upward slightly. He took a few steps back and stared at what was peeking through the earth. It wasn't a wall or a machine, it was the side of a ship. For a moment he couldn't move. A ship in the middle of the forest made no sense. There was no ocean here, no river big enough to carry such a vessel. Yet as he brushed away more dirt, the lines became clearer. The structure had the same shape as a hull. His breath caught as he whispered to himself, "This can't be real." He took out his camera and snapped a few photos, then circled around again, searching for an opening. After pushing through a wall of ferns, he saw it, the bow of the ship half buried but unmistakable. It rose several meters high, its sharp edge eaten away by rust and moss. Vines hung down like curtains, wrapping around the steel like nature's claim of ownership. He reached out and placed his hand on it. The surface was cold and rough, but it felt alive somehow, as if it carried the memory of the sea. For a long moment he just stood there, staring. He could hear the faint drip of water from somewhere above and the distant call of a bird, yet everything else was still. The air felt heavier, like he had stepped into another world. The ship had become part of the forest. Trees grew through its deck and roots had split parts of its structure. It was both haunting and beautiful. He decided to climb a slope beside the ship to get a better view. From above he could see the outline more clearly. It was huge, easily the size of a small cargo vessel. Its hull stretched across the forest floor like a sleeping giant. Half of it was buried, and the other half lay hidden beneath thick layers of moss and soil. He took more pictures and then sat down, still trying to process what he was seeing. He wondered how it got here. The nearest body of water was miles away. No storm could possibly have carried something this big over land. Maybe it had once been a lake or an ancient sea, or maybe this was a forgotten experiment, something built and abandoned before anyone knew. The questions spun in his head faster than he could answer them. After resting for a bit, he decided to explore the area around the ship. He walked along its side, using his knife to cut through vines. As he went, he found bits of wood and metal scattered nearby. Some looked like parts of crates or barrels. He knelt to pick one up, brushing off the dirt. The wood crumbled easily, but it looked handmade, not natural. He took out his notebook and sketched what he saw. Then he noticed something odd on the ship's side, a faint pattern, barely visible beneath the rust. He rubbed it gently with his glove until letters began to appear. Most of them were gone, eaten away by time, but he could make out a few. They looked like part of a name or number, maybe once painted across the hull. He copied what he could into his notebook. It wasn't much, but it was a clue. The sun was starting to lower and golden light filtered through the trees. The forest had changed from eerie to peaceful, but the ship still felt out of place, like a giant secret frozen in time. The explorer decided to stay a little longer, setting up his camera on a tripod to record the surroundings. He spoke quietly into it, describing what he saw, careful not to sound overly excited. He had learned to stay calm in moments like this, to focus on collecting evidence before emotion took over. Still, he couldn't help smiling slightly. After years of exploring, this was by far the strangest thing he had ever found. He sat by the ship's side and thought about the people who might have once stood on its deck. Sailors, maybe traders or travelers. He imagined them facing a storm, waves crashing, lightning flashing, and then somehow ending up here, surrounded by trees instead of sea. The thought gave him chills. He looked around at the forest again, trying to picture what this place might have looked like long ago. Maybe it wasn't a forest then. Maybe it was a wide river or a shallow bay that had slowly disappeared with time. He took a deep breath, letting the quiet sink in. The forest was no longer silent. Now he could hear small sounds. The buzz of insects, the rustle of leaves, the creak of old branches. It felt like the forest was waking up again, curious about the visitor who had uncovered one of its oldest secrets. As the light began to fade, he knew he couldn't stay much longer. The path back would be difficult to find in the dark. He packed up his things and took one last walk around the ship. He placed his hand once more on its metal surface and whispered softly, almost as if speaking to it, "I'll be back." He left small markers along the way, pieces of bright tape tied to branches so he could return later. As he made his way back, he kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the forest to swallow the ship again, hiding it from sight. The air grew cooler, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. He moved quickly, but his mind stayed behind, replaying the image of that massive steel body resting quietly among the trees. When he finally reached the edge of the forest, the last light of day was slipping away. He sat down on a rock, exhausted yet filled with energy. He couldn't wait to examine the photos and notes he had taken. Whatever the explanation was, he had just found something extraordinary, something that would make people question what they thought they knew about the land and its history. Later that night, as he reviewed his pictures by the dim light of his camp lantern, the details amazed him even more. The structure's angles, the patterns of corrosion, the faint letters, all of it confirmed that this was no random piece of metal. It was a real ship. He zoomed in on one image and stared at it for a long time. There was no mistake. He closed his notebook and leaned back, staring at the night sky. The forest was dark and quiet around him, yet he felt a strange comfort. He had followed a rumor, a story that everyone else had dismissed, and it led him to something beyond imagination. He didn't know yet how or why it was there, but he knew one thing for sure. The world still held secrets waiting to be uncovered, and he had just found one of them. The next morning, the explorer woke early. He couldn't stop thinking about the ship he had found hidden among the trees. Every detail replayed in his mind, the way the metal glistened under the sunlight, the strange silence that surrounded it, and the feeling that he had stumbled upon something the world had forgotten. He packed his bag again, filled his water bottle, and decided to return to the site before the day got too hot. The forest greeted him with cool air and the soft hum of insects. He followed the small tape markers he had left on branches the day before. The path wasn't easy. Roots stuck out like ropes and branches scraped his jacket as he moved. It took him nearly an hour to reach the same clearing. When he saw the ship again, his heart quickened. It was still there, massive and silent, exactly as he had left it. Morning light slipped through the trees and landed on the rusted metal, giving it an almost golden glow. He walked closer, brushing off dew from the vines that hung across the hull. It felt strange being here alone. The forest was quiet, yet there was a weight to the place, as if time itself had slowed down around the ship. He took a deep breath, opened his bag, and pulled out his notebook and measuring tape. He wanted to study it properly this time, not just as an explorer chasing curiosity, but as someone documenting history. He started with simple observations. The ship's length seemed at least 200 feet, maybe more, though much of it was buried. The hull was thick steel, covered in rust and patches of moss. Near the bow, he found more faded paint, remnants of letters that looked like part of a name. He took pictures from every angle, moving slowly so he wouldn't miss anything. Occasionally, he'd pause to sketch in his notebook. When he knelt beside one of the openings in the hull, he noticed something unexpected. A small hole just wide enough to peek through revealed darkness inside. He used his flashlight to shine through, and for a split second he saw shapes. Metal beams, maybe parts of machinery, all swallowed by shadows. The beam of light caught the reflection of something shiny, but he couldn't reach it. He decided not to risk crawling in alone. The ground around it looked unstable, and one wrong step could trap him inside. He moved on, circling the ship carefully. Every few meters, the forest floor revealed small clues. Pieces of broken glass, fragments of wood, and what looked like parts of old rope. It was strange. These items didn't belong in a forest. He picked one up and studied it. The glass had a green tint like bottles used on ships in the old days. The rope was thick and stiff with age. He placed them gently in his bag to take back for examination. By midday, the sun had climbed high and the forest had grown warmer. He sat on a fallen log near the ship and took a break. He drank water and looked up at the giant structure before him. It still didn't make sense. How could a ship end up here so far from any river or sea? He took out his map again and traced the landscape with his finger. The nearest river was over 50 miles away, and the terrain between was mostly hills and dense woodland. He made a decision. He would contact a few people online who specialized in maritime history. Maybe someone would recognize the partial name on the hull or have records of missing ships. Before leaving the forest, he took a few final photos, one of the entire ship from a distance and several close-ups of the markings. He also recorded a short video, describing his discovery in a calm, steady voice. That evening, after reaching his small cabin near the edge of the woods, he connected his camera to his laptop and uploaded the images. The details were clearer on screen. He zoomed in on the faint letters. They seemed to spell something like N-est or maybe A-R-I-S. It was too worn to be sure. Still, he decided to post the images to an online forum where historians and explorers discussed old shipwrecks and lost artifacts. He wrote a short message explaining what he had found, keeping the location private for safety. At first, there were only a few replies. Some people congratulated him. Others doubted it was a real ship. One person even joked that it looked like an art installation. But within a day, the post started getting attention. Experienced divers, maritime experts, and even a few archaeologists commented. Some said the structure looked like a cargo vessel from the late 1800s or early 1900s. Others mentioned that during rare floods or geological shifts, ships had been found miles from water before. He spent the next few days reading every comment carefully. A few experts asked for more detailed images of the rivets and the hull shape, so he decided to go back again with better equipment. The following morning, the forest felt familiar now, like an old friend guarding a secret. He returned with a drone and a stronger flashlight. The drone helped him capture the ship from above, showing just how large it really was. From that angle, it looked like a giant skeleton resting peacefully among the trees. The pictures amazed him. While exploring again near the stern, he noticed a small box half buried in the dirt. It looked like a container made of metal, rusted almost to dust. Carefully, he used his pocket knife to pry it open. Inside, beneath layers of mud and rust, he found a brass object, round, flat, and heavy. He cleaned it gently with his cloth, and as the mud came off, he realized it was an old compass. The glass was cracked, but the needle still moved slightly. Around the edge, there were faint engravings. He brought it closer to his eyes and saw a date, 1889. His heart skipped. That meant the ship was at least 100 years old, maybe more. He packed the compass carefully, knowing it might help trace the ship's origin. Later that evening, he posted a new update online with fresh photos and details. This time, the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from around the world. A few maritime historians contacted him privately, asking if he could share coordinates for further study. He hesitated, not wanting the place to be overrun by curious visitors or treasure hunters. He decided to keep the exact location secret until he had more information. One message stood out. A retired sea captain from another country wrote to him, saying the ship's design reminded him of a small cargo vessel that went missing in the late 1800s, along a river that used to flow through that region. He mentioned that massive floods had hit during that time, destroying many routes and changing river paths. The explorer read that message several times. It sounded possible, yet it still didn't explain how such a large ship could have traveled this far inland. Over the next few days, he started collecting old maps and weather records. He visited the local library and even spoke to elderly villagers who had heard stories about the Iron Ghost in the woods. Some laughed, saying their grandparents talked about it when they were children. Others claimed the land used to flood heavily long ago, and strange objects were sometimes found after storms. Piece by piece, he was building a timeline. The compass, the faded letters, the historical floods, all of it suggested the ship had once been part of a river system that no longer existed. Maybe the floods had carried it here before the river changed course forever. One evening, he sat outside his cabin looking at the photos again. The forest had begun to feel alive to him, as if it had chosen to reveal this secret only when it was ready. He thought about how many years the ship had been hidden, how many seasons had passed, how many animals had made their homes inside its rusted walls. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a witness to time. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the story was incomplete. The direction of the ship's bow suggested it hadn't simply drifted here. It seemed as if it had been pushed or dragged by an incredible force. He planned to go back again soon, maybe bring a friend or two to help dig around the base safely. There was more buried beneath the ground, he was sure of it. Before turning in for the night, he took one last look at the compass he had found. Its cracked glass reflected the light from his lamp, and the old needle trembled slightly as if it still remembered the sea. He smiled faintly. The world was full of noise and distractions, yet here in this quiet forest, a piece of history had been waiting patiently for someone to notice. He didn't know what the next step would bring, but he was certain of one thing. This discovery was only the beginning. Whatever truth lay behind that ship among the trees, he was determined to uncover it, no matter how long it took. The explorer couldn't sleep much that night. His mind kept circling around the discovery and the messages he had received from people all over the world. Some believed his find was real history, others called it an illusion, but none could ignore how strange it was, a massive ship sitting deep in a forest, far from any sea. He stared at the photos on his laptop over and over again, zooming into the smallest details, hoping for a clue he might have missed. The next morning, he went back to the forest once more. The air was cool and thin fog covered the trees. Every sound seemed louder. The crunch of his boots, the call of distant birds, the rustle of wind through leaves. When he reached the ship, the fog drifted around it, making the structure look like a ghost rising from the ground. He stood there quietly for a few minutes, taking it in. No matter how many times he saw it, the sight still amazed him. He started exploring the area again, this time focusing on the ground around the ship. He wanted to know how deeply it was buried. He used a small metal probe to test the soil and found that parts of the hull extended several feet below the surface. That meant it had been there for a very long time, long enough for soil, roots, and plants to grow thick over it. As he worked, something caught his eye. Near the base of the hull, under a layer of moss, he saw what looked like carved marks on the metal. He knelt down and brushed them clean with his gloved hand. It wasn't a natural pattern. It looked like someone had scratched numbers or letters into the steel long ago. Most of it was unreadable, but one small section showed a faint series of digits. 1890. It matched the date on the old compass he had found earlier. His heartbeat quickened. The more clues he found, the more real the story became. When he returned to his cabin that evening, he sent the new photos to a maritime historian who had been following his posts online. The man replied quickly, saying the markings could be registration numbers used by shipbuilders in the late 1800s. He also mentioned that records from that period were often incomplete, but there had been reports of several cargo ships lost inland during extreme floods. One of them, he wrote, was a vessel that carried supplies and timber through river routes that connected to larger ports. That made the explorer think, could this be one of those ships? Over the next few days, the story of the forest ship began to spread across social media. News blogs picked it up, calling it one of the strangest discoveries in recent years. People started posting their own theories. Some believed it was a lost warship hidden during conflict. Others thought it was evidence that the ocean had once reached much farther inland. A few claimed it was an alien vessel disguised as a ship, which made him laugh quietly. He didn't care for wild ideas. He wanted truth, not fantasy. He tried to stay focused on research. One evening, while studying old topographic maps, he noticed something interesting. The forest where the ship sat used to be part of a river basin, more than 100 years ago. The map showed a wide river curving close to that area before changing course. It was possible that during a massive flood, the river could have overflowed and carried the ship farther inland. Once the waters receded, the vessel might have been trapped as the land dried and trees grew around it over time. Still, there was a problem. Even if that theory was true, how could a flood move something that heavy? Ships like that weighed thousands of tons. The thought kept him awake. He decided to test the soil around the site. The next day, he collected samples from different points, near the bow, around the stern, and a few meters away. Later, he sent them to a local geologist who agreed to analyze them. While waiting for results, he went back to the ship again. He couldn't stay away for long. Each time he returned, he noticed something new. On one visit, he spotted a set of wooden planks buried near the stern. When he dug them up gently, he realized they were shaped like parts of a crate or barrel. The wood had darkened with age, but when he tapped it lightly, it still held together. That meant it had been preserved under layers of soil. Inside one of the planks, he found a rusty nail and something small wedged into the corner, what looked like a fragment of cloth. It was almost black with age, but it was real fabric. He stored it carefully in a plastic pouch. A few days later, the geologist called. The sample showed traces of fine silt and river sand, not the usual forest soil. That confirmed one thing. The area had once been underwater. It might have been part of an ancient floodplain that had shifted over time. The explorer listened carefully, taking notes, his excitement growing with each word. This wasn't just a coincidence. Nature itself was giving him answers. That night he sat by the fire outside his cabin, holding the compass in his hand again. The flame's reflection danced across its cracked glass. He thought about the sailors who once used it to guide the ship. Maybe they had no idea that a single storm would carry them so far inland that their vessel would never touch water again. The thought made him both sad and amazed. He decided to visit the local museum in town the next day. The curator was an older man who had spent years studying the region's history. When the explorer showed him the photos, the curator's eyes widened. He leaned closer to the images and nodded slowly. "I've heard of a lost vessel," he said in a thoughtful tone. "There were stories of a flood in 1891. It destroyed several bridges and washed away a few transport ships along the river. Most were found downstream, but one was never recovered. They called it the Iron Shadow. It was said to be carrying timber and supplies before it disappeared." That name stuck in the explorer's mind. The Iron Shadow. It sounded poetic but also eerie. Could that be the ship he found? The timing matched, the materials matched, and the region fit perfectly. He thanked the curator and promised to share more information once he confirmed it. When he returned to the forest again, he looked at the ship differently. It no longer felt like just a mystery. It felt like a story of people, of history swallowed by time. He imagined the crew fighting through the storm, trying to control the ship as it was swept inland, the chaos of wind and rain, and then the silence when it finally stopped. He could almost hear echoes of that moment in the rustling leaves around him. Over the next week, he kept digging small sections around the hull, always careful not to damage anything. Beneath one corner, he found a chain link as thick as his wrist, still half buried. Nearby, he uncovered part of what looked like a metal ladder, fused into the ground. Every new discovery made him feel closer to understanding what had happened. One afternoon, as he was documenting the site, a few hikers wandered nearby. They asked if the rumors were true. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to attract too much attention, but then he smiled and said, "Yes, there's something here worth seeing, but it's fragile. Please don't disturb it." They nodded and watched from a distance, quietly amazed. That evening, as the sun set, the explorer sat on a fallen log beside the ship. The light turned the forest gold, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. He spoke softly into his recorder, describing his progress. His voice carried both exhaustion and wonder. "It's been weeks since I first found this place," he said. "And still, every day I come here, it feels new. The more I uncover, the more I realize this isn't just a mystery about a ship. It's a reminder of how nature changes, how time covers everything, and how stories can sleep for a century before waking again." The forest had grown quieter around him now, almost peaceful. The ship, once strange and out of place, seemed to belong here. It was as if the trees had accepted it long ago, wrapping it in roots and silence. Before leaving, he took one last photo of the ship standing tall among the trees, with the orange sky behind it. He knew the image would stay with him forever. The next step would be to bring in experts to study it properly, maybe even uncover its full history. But for now he was content. He had found the truth behind the legend, or at least the first pieces of it. As he walked back through the forest trail, he glanced over his shoulder once more. The ship was barely visible through the mist, but it was there, solid, silent, waiting. He smiled to himself. The world still had secrets worth chasing, and this one had chosen him to find it. The days that followed were busy for the explorer. Word about the strange ship hidden in the forest was spreading fast. More people were becoming curious, and a few local reporters had even reached out to him. He didn't want to make the place a tourist spot or have it destroyed by careless visitors, so he decided to work quietly and only share new information when he was sure of it. His goal wasn't fame. He just wanted to understand how this giant piece of history ended up stranded among trees. He spent most of his mornings studying old river maps and geological charts. The more he compared them, the more something started to make sense. A long time ago, the land had looked completely different. The wide river that once flowed through the region had shifted many times due to natural changes and heavy flooding. He realized that the area where the ship now rested used to be close to a river bend, one that no longer existed. Over the years, the flow of water must have changed direction, leaving parts of the old riverbed dry. That gave him a new idea. What if the ship wasn't brought here by a mysterious force but by nature itself? He decided to get help from professionals. After weeks of communication, he managed to convince a small team of archaeologists and environmental scientists to visit the site. When they arrived, they were as stunned as he had been the first day. The massive ship looked surreal, its rusted body surrounded by roots and branches, almost as if the forest had grown up to protect it. The team began setting up their equipment, marking spots with small flags and string. They planned to study the soil, the angle of the ship, and any remains that could explain how long it had been there. The explorer watched closely as they worked. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in the mystery. It was comforting to see others who were just as fascinated. One of the archaeologists knelt near the hull and brushed away the dirt with care. After a few minutes, he found what looked like an old chain link. Another uncovered a small piece of wood that had been pressed deep into the mud. Every little find made the team more excited. The forest seemed to be revealing its secrets piece by piece. By afternoon, the scientists began taking measurements. They used special instruments to study the soil layers beneath the ship. When they compared samples from different depths, they noticed clear signs of flooding, thick layers of sediment that could only have formed through strong water movement. This discovery supported the explorer's theory. A massive flood, perhaps more than a century ago, could have pushed the ship inland and trapped it when the waters receded. Over time, the forest grew around it, burying its lower half. Still, there were many unanswered questions. How powerful was the flood? Why hadn't the ship been recorded in local history? And who were the people who once sailed it? Over the next week, the team continued their research. They set up a small camp near the site and worked from dawn till evening. The explorer helped whenever he could, taking photos, collecting samples, and keeping records. At night, they would all sit by a small fire, sharing thoughts about what they had found. The air was cool, and the sound of insects filled the silence between their conversations. One evening, as they talked, the explorer shared his findings from the museum. He mentioned the story of the missing vessel called the Iron Shadow. Everyone listened carefully. The archaeologist nodded, saying the timeline matched the condition of the metal and the items found nearby. One of them said softly, "If this really is the Iron Shadow, then we're sitting beside a piece of forgotten history." That night, the explorer couldn't sleep. He sat outside his tent, looking toward the faint outline of the ship under the moonlight. It looked peaceful, almost alive in its stillness. He thought about the crew who might have once stood on its deck, unaware that their journey would end in a forest hundreds of miles from the sea. He imagined the storm that could have caused it, the roaring water, the fear, and the silence that followed. The forest had kept their story safe for over 100 years, and now it was finally being told. The next morning, the team began careful digging around the base of the hull to study the soil layers more deeply. As they dug, they discovered several interesting objects: rusted bolts, fragments of wooden planks, and even what looked like part of an old lantern. The explorer held the lantern piece in his hands, brushing away the dirt. Its glass was shattered, but the shape was still clear. He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection to the people who had once used it. It was as if their presence still lingered there, waiting to be remembered. Later that day, one of the scientists called out to him. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a section of the ground near the stern. There was a distinct layer of dark sediment that stood out from the rest. When they examined it closer, they realized it was old riverbed soil, proof that the ship had indeed been surrounded by water at some point. The entire team grew quiet as the weight of that discovery settled in. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It was real evidence. The explorer felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had followed a trail of rumors and curiosity, and it had led to something truly remarkable. Yet he knew the work wasn't over. They still had to piece together the human story behind it. Over the following days, they uncovered more small artifacts: a broken spoon, a rusted hinge, and a small circular object that looked like part of a clock or compass. Each item felt like a whisper from the past. The explorer handled them with care, as if afraid to disturb their fragile silence. At night, he kept writing in his notebook, recording every discovery and thought. His entries weren't just about facts, they were about feelings too. He wrote about how the forest seemed to breathe differently at night, how the ship looked like a monument of patience, and how it reminded him that history isn't always buried in museums. Sometimes it sleeps quietly in unexpected places. After nearly 2 weeks of study, the scientists finished collecting their data. They promised to return later with more equipment to continue the work, but for now they had gathered enough evidence to support a strong conclusion. The ship had been part of a massive flood event sometime around the late 1800s. The flood had carried it inland along an ancient river path, which eventually disappeared as the land shifted. Nature had preserved it in the most unlikely way. Before the team left, they gathered near the ship one last time. The explorer stood quietly beside them, looking up at the rusted bow. The archaeologist spoke softly, saying, "It's strange, isn't it? Something once built to cross oceans now rests forever among trees." Everyone nodded. It was a beautiful thought, a reminder that even man-made creations could become part of nature's story in the end. After they packed up and left, the explorer stayed behind for a while longer. He walked slowly around the ship, touching the metal as he passed. The surface felt rough, cold, and strong, just like the day he first found it. But now it felt different too, like a friend he had come to know. He sat down near the same log where he had first rested weeks ago. The air was filled with the sound of distant birds and the soft rustle of leaves. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting warm light across the ship's surface. He smiled to himself. What had once been a rumor had turned into one of the greatest discoveries of his life. He thought about how easily the story could have stayed hidden forever. If he hadn't followed his curiosity, if he had ignored those strange tales, the Iron Shadow would still be sleeping under roots and moss. That thought gave him a quiet sense of pride, not the loud kind that seeks attention, but the gentle kind that comes from knowing you've brought something meaningful to light. As evening approached, he decided it was time to head back. He took one last look at the ship, now glowing softly in the golden light. The trees swayed gently as if saying goodbye. He promised himself he would return, not just to study it more, but to keep it safe. When he reached the edge of the forest, he turned around for one final glance. The ship was barely visible through the thick trees, just a faint shape in the distance. Yet it stood there, timeless and silent, surrounded by the life that had grown around it. He whispered quietly, "You've been here a long time. Now the world knows your story." With that, he walked away, feeling a calm he hadn't felt in years. The mystery was no longer about finding answers. It was about understanding the bond between time, nature, and human history. The forest ship wasn't just a discovery. It was a message from the past, reminding him that sometimes the most incredible stories don't begin in books or oceans. They begin with curiosity and a single step into the unknown.